Good afternoon, everyone. Dear friends, I must thank you for joining this ISIS virtual forum. And the topic today is Parliament as the Grand Inquest of the Nation, proposals for enhancing Parliament's institutional efficacy. We have with us today a very distinguished personality, Dr. Shad, Saleem Faruqi, very well-known figure. He needs no introduction. And to do justice to him, I must mention a few things in his background. Prof. Shad has been teaching law for over 45 years in two distinguished local universities, namely UC Technology Mara or UiTM, and also the University of Malaya. At UC Malaya, he holds the chair of Tengku Abdul Rahman Chair of Law at the Faculty of Law. And he's now, he's the Tun Hussein Chair at Institute of Strategic International Studies, Malaysia, which is a very distinguished position. And Prof. Shad will be speaking on a variety of topics on parliamentary matters, which is, I think, very topical now, particularly our political position in the country. And also our parliament has not met except once the past 6 months. Just met once to hear the inaugural speech of the Duli Muhammadiyah Tan Agong. So today, Prof. Shad will touch a variety of topics. I'm sure they're very interesting. And after his presentation, I will open the floor for question and answer. And I welcome questions from you all. In the interest of time, I don't want to take much time. I think it's better that all of us listen to Professor Shad. So Professor Shad, I have nothing much to say. I'm letting you know. The floor is yours now. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Dr. Sulaiman Mahmud, board member of ISIS and chairman of this session. Yang Berbahagia Datin Paduka Dr. Farida Dato Abdullah, chairman Noah Foundation. Yang Berbahagia General Tan Sri Dr. Muhammad Hashim Muhammad Ali, chairman of the board, ISIS Malaysia. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. May you all have the blessings of peace and good health. I'm deeply honored by this invitation and by your distinguished presence. My topic is Parliament as the Grand Inquest of the Nation, proposals for enhancing Parliament's institutional efficacy. May I begin by saying that it is not reliable to measure the depth of the sea at low tide. Perhaps this analogy is relevant to our parliament that has been in abeyance for the last 6 months, except for a few hours on 18th May. Slide 1. Parliament has also been a bystander in the devastating health and economic crisis and the political instability engulfing our beloved land. Next. This bystander's role is not what our Constitution envisaged. 49 articles of the Constitution out of a total of 183 deal with the composition, qualification, legislative powers, financial powers, privileges, and immunities and procedures of our parliament. Next. The electoral process for choosing representatives to the Dewan Negara is covered by Articles 113 to 120 and the 13th schedule. Elections to parliament and to the legislative assemblies of the states incur a massive investment. May I use the word investment? 500 million ringgit in 2018, and I'm told that it will rise to 750 million or so for the next electoral exercise due to the reduction of voting age to 18 and the substantial increase in the number of voters. Next. Let me touch on some of the constitutional functions envisaged by our Constitution, our document of destiny. In our Westminster system of parliamentary government, the Constitution reposes in our federal legislature the following functions. I have outlined 11 such functions. There may well be some others. Number one, the legislative function of enacting, amending, and repealing laws. In my humble view, this function should include, but does not at the moment include, it should include the scrutiny of subsidiary or delegated legislation and a leadership role in law reform. Number two, oversight of the executive and performance, executive policy and performance to ensure accountability, answerability, and responsibility of the political executive to Parliament. Number three, control over national finance. This should include oversight of financial policy, examination of the use of financial resources optimally, allocation of the annual budget, and review of the reports of the Auditor General to examine how the allocations were utilized. Number four, the constituency function of improving the well-being of citizens by redressing constituents' grievances and engaging with them to obtain feedback on government's policies and programs. Number five, the giving of democratic legitimacy to the government in power. Number six, representing the wishes of the electorate in the Dewan Rakyat. That's why we say that the members of parliament are Ahli. The Ahli Dewan Rakyat, so they are actually representing the people. Number seven, scrutinizing the Yangdi Pertuanagong's emergency proclamation and emergency ordinances if there is an emergency under Article 150. Number eight, approving or rejecting the Election Commission's proposals for new electoral boundaries. Number nine, safeguarding Malay reserves. Even though Malay reserves are actually a state function, nevertheless, the federal parliament has a role to protect Malay reserves. Number 10, exercising parliamentary privileges to protect the House, its members and its officers, and to ensure compliance with its decisions and orders. Number 11, the Dewan Negara has the additional function of representing the 13 states and the federal territories and giving voice to minorities and marginalized groups that may not obtain representation in the Dewan Rakyat under our present electoral system. Now, I have to say this with sadness, that except for the constituency function, the Parliament of Malaysia fails to perform its other duties satisfactorily. Theory versus reality must be studied, and reforms must be proposed to enhance the institutional efficacy of our premier legislative institution. Due to time constraints, I will concentrate on just 3 or 4 functions out of the 11. Number one, the making of laws. Next. The political reality is that the executive dominates the legislative agenda. It drafts the bills, embargoes the bills under the Official Secrets Act, determines the timing when the bill is to be introduced, and then uses its party whips, its party officers to bulldoze legislative proposals without much scrutiny in Parliament. Sometimes a bill is passed on the very day it was introduced. In a 1992 study covering 4 years, which I had undertaken, I found that 79% of the bills, Tansri, were passed without a comma or full stop being changed. 15% of the bills, however, were amended. 5% were withdrawn due to criticisms on the floor. Understanding Order, next one, Understanding Order 49, private MPs, and by private MPs I mean MPs who are not holding the post as a cabinet minister or deputy or political secretary. Understanding Order 49, private MPs are allowed to propose private members' bills. Though many private bills have been introduced over the last 6 decades since 1959, when Parliament first met, no private bill has ever crossed the threshold to become a law in this country. Thanks to this contrast with the UK, where nearly 20% of the laws passed by Parliament are actually sponsored by private members. Now, before bills are laid for the first reading, they are embargoed under the Official Secrets Act. Next one. Even after the bills have been laid for first reading, there is no regular tradition of engaging stakeholders to discuss the content of bills at committee stage. This is despite standing orders of the houses permitting the establishment of legislation committees. I'm sorry to report that in the last 61 years, legislation committees have been appointed less than 10 times. Next. Along with bills, there is a great deal of subsidiary or delegated legislation authorized by Parliament, whereby executive is given the power to frame the laws. Sadly, there is no parliamentary committee to vet or scrutinize subsidiary legislation. And see, the problem is very serious, because if we examine the numbers, for every one act of Parliament, there will be 20, 30 or 40 pieces of subsidiary legislation. They are laws, they affect rights, they impose duties, but Parliament does not have a committee to scrutinize subsidiary legislation. Parliament also plays no part in proposals for law reform. Neither is there an independent law reform commission to report to Parliament. It is clear, therefore, that the center of gravity of the legislative process has unconstitutionally shifted from Parliament to Putrajaya. All in all, Parliament legitimates. It does not legislate. So what can be done? Next one. What can be done to give to Parliament a meaningful role in the legislative process? I have some humble suggestions. Number one, policy papers to enable MPs to be better informed and to enable citizens and affected interests to work with MPs. The government must issue policy papers on proposed bills to enable citizens to provide feedback and contribute to the discourse. Decisions in which people participate are decisions they are likely to respect. Next one. Copies of bills should not be embargoed and covered by the Official Secrets Act. MPs must be given bills, copies of bills at least 2 weeks before the first reading to enable them to seek independent advice. Next one, legislation committees, bipartisan parliamentary committees to examine bills before or after the second reading must be appointed, as is permitted by the standing orders of Parliament. In its scrutiny of bills, the committee is allowed, or committees are allowed, to invite experts, NGOs, stakeholders, and members of the public to comment on the bills. And here is a suggestion from me for post-enactment review, Tansri. It is humbly proposed that every bill must contain a clause mandating the appointment of a committee to review legislation in the post-enactment era and to report to the minister concerned. Next one. Private members' bills should be encouraged, as these may involve participation by NGOs and they may reflect the democratic impulses of society. The Speaker's office should draw lots, and those MPs whose names appear on the top 3 or 5 slots should be given time and financial aid, as in some democracies like the UK, to submit their legislative proposals to the House. Next one. COVID-19. The pandemic that is sweeping the world requires a wide-ranging COVID-19 Special Measures Act 2020 to protect businesses, workers, borrowers of loans, contractors, suppliers, and any other persons or groups adversely affected by this pandemic. Despite the desirability of social distancing, the following 4 techniques can be adopted by a parliament to continue with its legislative duties. Number 1, Parliament can meet online. Number 2, Quorum in the Dewan Rayat is 26, understanding Order 13. The quorum rule can be employed to reduce the number of MPs attending the House, and thereby maintaining social distancing. With bipartisan cooperation, the government and the opposition can agree to send 30 MPs each in a House of 222 to allow the business to proceed and social distancing to be observed. In my humble view, committees can continue to meet upstairs to vet legislation, to examine financial proposals. Next one. Most acts of parliament permit subsidiary legislation to be framed by the executive outside of parliament. This technique has indeed been employed to meet many needs. However, its main limitation is that subsidiary legislation must be made under a parent statute and not contrary to it. In some cases, amendments are needed to the parent law, to the Contracts Act, to the Companies Act, to the Hire Purchase Act, to the Banking and Financial Institutions Act, and that delegated legislation cannot do. We need Parliament to sit in the three other ways to be able to examine these need for changes. Next one, a joint committee of both houses on subsidiary legislation must be appointed to advise Parliament on whether to accept or annul subsidiary legislation. Next, we need to increase the number of parliamentary sittings, Tan Sri. The Malaysian Parliament meets for about 50 to 75 days per year, if we look at the last 61 years. In 2020, it has met only one day in the first 6 months. It is slotted to meet for 52 days this year. In contrast, the British Parliament meets for 180 days in a year on the average. Now, increase in the number of parliamentary sittings will allow more time to be spent on legislative and other business of the House. Next one, committee work. The Malaysian tradition is that when the House prorogues, committee work ceases. I don't see why that should be so. I humbly propose that despite an adjournment or a prorogation of Parliament, adjournment is when, let us say, they adjourn on Thursday to meet on Monday. But if it's more than 14 days adjournment, that's a prorogation. Now, I humbly believe that MPs are paid. I think committee work must continue all year round. No specific law, in my view, forbids our paid MPs from such service to the nation. It is noteworthy that many special select committees established by Parliament have a tenure of 2 years and are not dissolved upon prorogation. Even on proper prorogation, they are not dissolved. Next one, the Dewan Negara. To lighten the legislative load of the Dewan Rayat and to enable greater scrutiny of legislative proposals, some politically non-controversial, non-money bills should originate in the Dewan Negara. Now, this will require both houses to sit concurrently. There is this belief that Dewan Rayat must meet first, then only Dewan Negara. No law requires that. Two houses can meet concurrently, and that would reduce the burden of the Dewan Rayat. Legislative assistance, as in most democracies, MPs must be supplied with research staff to assist them to perform their parliamentary work. I have to say this with sadness, that support services are not available to our MPs. They neither have an office in Parliament, nor do they get legislative assistance. Tan Sri, even in societies which are economically not as well off as Malaysia, often MPs will have 4 to 5 legislative assistants. Law reform, the two houses should set up a joint select committee on law reform. Then there should be a law reform commission, an independent law reform commission, and this commission should report to the joint select committee on law reform, which I had proposed earlier, to ensure that the elected representatives have a say in keeping the law responsive to the felt necessities of the times. Ali, let me skip 29 and 30. Let's go to 31. Oversight of the executive. In our system of responsible government, the political executive is part of Parliament. and is required to answer questions, supply information, justify policies. This is very different from the US system, where the president and his cabinet, called secretaries, are not and cannot be members of the Congress. They don't sit there. But in our system, MPs, cabinet ministers must either belong to one house or the other, and they must answer questions, justify policies, supply information. In extreme circumstances, the Dewan Raat can even dismiss the government on a vote of no confidence under Article 43. The political reality is, however, quite different. Question time is often a ritual exercise in evasion. Due to time constraints, not all questions listed in the daily order paper are answered. 30 to 35 questions are listed, but only 10 to 12 can be reached in that question time. The precedence of questions on the order paper frequently arouses the suspicion that controversial questions are deliberately placed towards the end of the order paper. Next one, number 34. To strengthen Parliament's oversight function, procedures need to be developed to determine the order of questions to allay the suspicion that controversial questions are deliberately placed towards the end of the daily order paper. In the UK, the order in which the questions are asked is determined by a shuffle carried out randomly by a computer. In New Zealand, questions are arranged proportional to party membership. Then written replies. If questions are not reached, then in Malaysia, written replies are to be given. There should be a specified time limit within which these replies must reach the MP. Prime Minister's question time. Once a week, the PM must be required to face the House. Next one, departmental committees. In the long range, each ministry should have a counterpart departmental parliamentary committee to evaluate the performance of the ministry. As a beginning, parliamentary committees can be responsible for a cluster of ministries or departments. But in the long range, if there is an education ministry, there should be a parliamentary committee on education. Scrutiny of executive appointments. A special standing committee on executive appointments must be created to scrutinize the PM's nominees for all key administrative, financial, and commercial institutions. I'm conscious that such an attempt was made, but it was never really put into operation. Power to punish for contempt. Next slide. Parliament should use its power to punish for contempt any ministers, civil servants, or citizens who defy a parliamentary order to appear before a committee and to supply information. The discourtesy to Parliament of senior civil servants sending their junior colleagues to appear before parliamentary committees must be censored. I have at least one case to answer. In Australia, a minister was cited for contempt because he refused to supply a document to a parliamentary committee. A minister was cited for contempt. Next one, motion of confidence, no confidence. A motion of no confidence is implied in Article 43, Clause 4 of the Perlembagaan Persekutuan of the Federal Constitution. However, very sadly, I have to report, the standing orders of the Dewan Raat do not specifically provide for such a motion. So I humbly recommend that the standing orders should be amended to prevent a repetition of the precedent after GE 13, that the motion of no confidence was sought to be introduced, and the then speaker said there is no provision for it in the standing orders, and as such, the motion will fail. Opposition business. Opposition business must be allocated special time, at least 1 hour a week. Broadcast. I think parliamentary proceedings should be broadcast live, or perhaps a delayed broadcast by 15 minutes to enable the speaker to expunge unparliamentary or inflammatory words. At the moment, only selected portions of the proceedings are put on air. Senators. Malaysia should activate Article 45, Clause 4A and B of the Federal Constitution to enable Parliament by law to increase the number of state senators from 2 to 3, and to provide for direct vote of the senators, by the electors in that state. The Constitution itself says that the state senators, which are 2 right now, so 13 states times 2, 26. The 26 actually can be doubled to it can be made from 2 to 3, so 39. And the Constitution also says that the state senators which are indirectly elected can actually be elected by the Rayat, like members of the Dewan Rayat. The Constitution provides for it. Shadow cabinet, next one. The largest party or coalition that does not form the government should be given recognition as the official opposition and should put forward its shadow cabinet. Perhaps an allowance should be given. Let's skip next slide, go to 45. Scrutiny of national finance. The Malaysian Parliament sadly plays very little, if any, role in long-term economic policy. Though we observe the formality of budget debates, the executive monopolizes economic policies. In any case, the annual budget is always followed by supplementary budgets, which modify significantly the thrust of the main budget. Parliament really merely legitimates. Disproportionately large allocations. Next one. Large allocations for the Prime Minister's department. Some say the PM's department gets as much as 15 to 20% of the budget. So they give to the PM much leeway to use patronage. The jurisdiction of the Public Accounts Committee is limited to those agencies audited by the Auditor General. The Public Accounts Committee cannot obviously examine the budgets, examine the working of the finances in government departments, so it relies on the PAC. But sadly, the PAC does not examine every government department that either receives or generates money, because under the laws, the Yang di Pertonagong has the power to declare some agencies as off-budget agencies. And they then have their own auditors, not the Auditor General. The Auditor General has no oversight over off-budget agencies or non-financial institutions so declared by the Yang di Pertonagong. Sadly, the 1MDB scandal clearly illustrates how ineffective Parliament can be in checking executive malfeasance in the financial field. By way of reforms in the area of finance, we need to have a select committee on financial policy and expenditure in the Dewan Rayat. Then, Sri, may I point out, in Australia, Parliament has a budget office paid for by the taxpayer, attached to Parliament. And the job of the budget office is to give a scholarly, non-partisan analysis of the budget for MPs to rely on during their debates. Yes. Yes, indeed. The Public Accounts Committee, its jurisdiction must be extended. Next one. No audit report should be withheld from Parliament under the Official Secrets Act. Then, Sri, my impression of the law is that Parliament, during parliamentary proceedings, is absolutely immune from all laws except one, and that is the Sedition Act. Sedition Act applies in Parliament, but the Penal Code, the Defamation Act, the Official Secrets Act, they do not apply in Parliament, and yet actually Official Secrets Act is applied to papers laid before Parliament. Let's skip 50. Let's go on to 54. I'm on the issue of constituency function. Parliament must set up a special select committee on public grievances to scrutinize complaints from the public. The existing Public Complaints Bureau should be replaced by an independent ombudsman, by whatever name we want to call it. We can call him Mohtasib, we can call him by any other name, but an independent ombudsman to investigate maladministration by the executive. Can we go to slide 57? I'm trying to rush through. Each MP should be given financial assistance to set up a service center in his constituency. Many MPs do that from their own pocket. The allocation to all MPs must be equal in line with Article 8's rule of equality before the law. The reason I point this out is, Tansri, that after GE 13, Barisan MPs were given an allocation, but not opposition. In my humble view, that's a violation of Article 8, equality before the law. Every MP must be given an equal allocation. Service centers will need support staff. Now that obviously has financial implications. Let's skip slide 58, slide 60. Other reforms. In developed democracies, the key to Parliament's institutional efficacy lies in a strong committee system. Many of the functions of Parliament, especially the making of laws, the control of national expenditure, and the holding of the executive to account, can be greatly assisted by the working of the committee system. Regrettably, the committee system in Malaysia is underdeveloped. However, Tansri, the good news is that this reform of improving our committees can be accomplished without any change to the constitution or to any laws. All that it needs is some amendments to the standing orders. And may I humbly point out, standing orders are not laws of the land. They are the law of the House. They were not passed by Parliament. They were passed by the House itself. That's why they are called standing orders. They are not called an act of Parliament. So really, it's quite simple then. Standing orders could be recommended for changes by the House's Rules Committee. In fact, between 2018 and 2019, slide 61, several new committees were established. Consideration of Bills Committee, Budget Committee, Rights and Gender Equality Committee, Major Public Appointments Committee, Defense and Home Affairs Committee, Federal State Relations Committee, Human Rights and Constitutional Affairs, Innovation and Environment, Elections, International Relations and Trade. These were exhilarating reforms when they took place. I hope that Tan Sri Muhyiddin's government can continue with these committees as an exercise in strengthening the function of Parliament. Slide 63. The Public Accounts Committee must be chaired by the opposition member. This reform was accomplished in 2018 and should be continued. Next one, the committees must be assisted by experts and empowered to hold public hearings. All committees must be assisted by some experts. The committees should invoke their privilege to compel ministers, civil servants to appear before committees. Committees should meet even if Parliament is under adjournment or prorogation. Next one, 65, strengthening separation of powers. Some provisions of the Constitution secure, but sadly others weaken the independence of the legislature from the executive. Number one, the life of the elected house is fixed by the Constitution at 5 years. Article 55, Clause 3. Unfortunately, the PM has the power to advise the King to prematurely dissolve the House. This is so in all parliamentary democracies, or most parliamentary democracies. Now, the safeguard in the Constitution is that the King need not listen to the PM's request. He can say no. Under Article 40, Clause 2B, an advice to dissolve Parliament prematurely can be rejected by the King. He has a discretion. In the UK, however, recently, a reform has been made to provide for a fixed term Parliament. Next one, the PM has the power to advise the Yang di-Pertuangan on the summoning and the prorogation of Parliament, Article 55. The constitutional safeguard is that no more than 6 months can elapse between the last sitting in one session and the first meeting in the next session. So the PM cannot keep Parliament in abeyance for too long. Unfortunately, Article 55 also means that the political executive can keep the legislature in prorogation for extended periods of time, up to 6 months. In the UK, the courts can review the PM's advice to prorogue the House. if the purpose of prorogation was to prevent Parliament from exercising its constitutional functions. We had a case last year, actually, where before Brexit, House of Commons was prorogued, and the court said that's an abuse of power. Next one, the first sitting of the House in each session is proclaimed by the King, acting on the advice, of course, of the PM. But the dates for subsequent meetings are determined by the leader of the House, who is the Prime Minister. This is why Parliament met for only half a day on 18th May, and then was prorogued to accommodate the PM's wish. The daily agenda and the business of the House allows the government to determine and to dominate the proceedings. Standing Order 14 has a list of large number of topics. Almost all the topics in the beginning are topics of government business. So the government has a right to determine the order of business, and it dominates the proceedings. Government business takes precedence over private members' business. Next one, the Speaker of the Dewan Raat and President of the Senate are elected by their houses and are not appointed by the executive. So even though the government changed in February, the Speaker and the President of the Senate have remained in place. Though, of course, the House has the power to remove them, but they have, in that respect, security of tenure, at least as far as the executive is concerned. Our constitution allows a non-parliamentarian to be elected as a speaker. Some people may criticize that. The idea is that perhaps a retired judge, a non-partisan person, could helm the affairs of the Dewan Raat. Next one. Under Article 65, the secretary, actually legally it's called clerk, but the secretary to the House belongs to the general public service of the Federation and is transferable to another public service. This is unfortunate and must be amended. In my humble view, Parliament should have the power to hire its own staff under the reenacted Parliamentary Services Act, which used to exist but then was repealed. Next one. In the Dewan Raat, all MPs are elected. There are no reserved seats for the army, for the police, or executive appointees, as in some other ASEAN countries. Sadly, however, the Dewan Negara is mostly appointed. Appointed senators are in a majority. The ratio of appointed senators to indirectly elected state senators is 44 to 26. 44 appointed, 26 state. But may I please point out, Tansri, the ratio at the time of the Constitution was 16 appointed, 26, 22, 11 times 2, 22 state senators. So that ratio has been drastically altered over the years through amendments. Each House of Parliament enjoys many privileges and immunities. Unfortunately, since 1970, the Sedition Act applies fully to parliamentary proceedings so that sensitive issues are not discussed because they may cause trouble outside. My humble view is that we need rethinking on these issues. MPs should have the freedom to debate in temperate and sane ways. They must be allowed to debate everything. However, standing orders could require that anything that touches on a number of issues, there should be a notice given to the Speaker so that he can clear the visitors' galleries. He can bar the press so that the House could sit in camera, in other words, all by itself, without participation from outsiders. The remuneration of MPs and senators is provided for by law, and the executive cannot interfere. Unfortunately, next slide. Unfortunately, there is no bar to the PM's power of patronage to appoint MPs to hold office in statutory bodies, corporations, and GLCs. This was a controversial issue some time ago, Tansri, whether MPs can hold an office of profit. I'm sorry to report that under the Constitution, Article 160, office of profit is defined narrowly to refer to an office in public services. So an MP cannot be a member of the police force or cannot be holding a civil service post, but he can hold posts in statutory bodies, corporations, and GLCs. We need a Freedom of Information Act. We need a code, next one, a code of conduct for all MPs to be enforced by the Privileges Committee of Parliament. Tan Sri, this is something very close to my heart. Next one, Institute of Parliamentary Affairs. For the judiciary, we have ILCAP. Yes. We also have a judicial academy in the offing. For civil servants, we have INTAN. Yes. What do we have for Parliament? I think we need an Institute of Parliamentary Affairs. Next one, I think the job of Parliament should be a full-time job. A Parliament that sits 50 to 75 days a year cannot possibly cope with an executive that works overtime throughout the year. There should be, if possible, a fixed-term Parliament subject to guidance from the law in the UK. There are two exceptions to the fixed 5-year term. One exception is if there is a successful vote of no confidence, then election will be called. Or if 2/3 majority on the floor requests early election. Party hopping. It's a controversial topic. Next one. Anti-hopping laws should be enacted so that if an MP changes sides, which is his right to change, he must nevertheless go back to the Rakyat, go back to the electorate and seek a new mandate. However, in view of the judicial decision in Nordin Saleh, which says that changing parties, crossing the floor, hopping, defection is part of freedom of association. So we'll need an amendment to the Constitution, Article 10, 1C. The other alternative could be if the federal court could review its decision in Nordin Saleh and say that there is no illegality in barring party hopping, because Tan Sri, the freedom of association is subject to number of limitations. One limitation is morality. Now, morality can mean political morality, but the federal court interpreted the word morality to refer to conventional morality. So the federal court can review its decision or the constitution. It's a matter of ethics. Ethics. Hopping, yes. So political ethics, yes, indeed. Reform of the Senate, I already touched on this earlier. Article 45, Clause 4 envisages that sometime in the future, the Senate should also be elected, at least the state senators will be elected by the Rakyat. Caretaker government, I just need about 4 more minutes, Sansri. Caretaker government to promote fair and free elections. A remarkable but now repealed innovation from Bangladesh deserves our consideration. That's slide 80, caretaker. In Bangladesh at one time it was the law that pending a general election, the PM must resign and the president will then appoint, in Bangladesh, the president will appoint an impartial, retired or serving luminary to lead the country during the electoral contest. Now, this was a fantastic innovation. It would mean that elections then would be conducted by a politically impartial president or leader. But then sadly, they repealed it. Now, by way of conclusion, I wish to say this, Tan Sri, and to all learned listeners, with these reforms, the legitimacy and institutional efficacy of Parliament may be enhanced. Next slide. And Parliament may be able to act as a check and balance against the omnipotent executive. However, I do acknowledge that there is an undemocratic trend worldwide, Tan Sri, that representative legislatures everywhere in the world have become less reflective of popular opinion because of the growing role of money in politics. Legislatures have also lost influence to bureaucratic agencies, to central banks, to free trade, and to international institutions. So the traditional democratic theory of a representative parliament as the grand inquest of the nation is suffering tremendous drawback because of recent developments. Now, by itself, none of the reforms that I have taken the liberty to mention can roll back the tide of authoritarian government anywhere in the world, everywhere in the world. But put together, these reforms may collectively constitute a torrent of pressure that may restore some pride to our representative institutions and restore the constitutional scheme of things. Thank you so much, Tansri. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Shad Faruqi. It's been a very exhaustive analysis of the possible changes we can make to our parliament. And certainly has been done in a very authoritative way. And in so doing, so Professor Shah has made some comparison with other countries so that they are not new, but they can definitely be, be taken examples by our country. Dear friends and listeners, I'm sure you're all waiting to have a session of question and answer. And some of you have given your questions. Maybe let me ask Harris whether Harris can, pick a few questions first, and Professor Shad can answer them. We go that way, huh?
Yes.
Okay, Harris.
All right. Thank you, Tan Sri Sulaiman, Chair of the Forum, and also Board of Director, ISIS Malaysia. Prof. Shad, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. So as Tan Sri mentioned earlier, I'll be handling mainly the Q&A session for today. So let's see. At 2:46 p.m., Deban Kumar Selvaratnam had asked, what does Prof. Shad think in his personal opinion of the bill on the anti-hopping law, and if this law succeeds, does it violate the Article 10 of the Federal Constitution, specifically the right of Malaysian citizens towards freedom of association? Also at about the same time, Jessica Marshall had asked, when Prof. Shad, you had suggested post-enactment review, how long post its enactment do you suggest the review should be done? And is the span of 2 years, she suggests that a span of 2 years, or is it dependent on the content of the bill itself? I think we can proceed with those two questions first, Prof.
Anti-hopping law was the first question by Kumar just now.
Thank you very much. On this anti-hopping law, I have to confess that the issue is quite contentious. Personally speaking, I'm not in support of this phenomena of people crossing the floor. Please forgive me if any of you are from India. At one time in India, one legislator from the state of Punjab hopped 5 times in the course of 5 years. And they used to jokingly say, I Ram, Gai Ram. Mr. Ram is coming, Mr. Ram is going. Now, why people hop could be for ideological reasons, idealism. Winston Churchill crossed the floor evidently 3 times. On the other hand, people can hop, defect in Sabah, in Kelantan, in Johor, in so many states recently. They can hop for other reasons. So I'm deeply troubled by this fact that governments rise and fall with the movement of people from this aisle to that aisle. Now, second factor that troubles me is this. The electorate voted. We spent 500 million ringgit for the election. I do not know how to answer in my class when the students say, but we voted in this way, and now we find that those who lost are actually constituting the government. And by the way, I'm not talking only at the federal level. I remember in 1994, the case of Pyrin. He won hands down. But within about 15 days, his majority evaporated because of crossing the floor. In Perak, there was this incident and many other states. So I'm not in favor of this phenomena of party hopping, but people have a right to change their associations, but they should go back to the people and say, last time I sought your assistance on this platform, now I have changed my mind, I've changed my heart, I've developed new values, new ideology, please vote me again. If the people vote the person again, then he returns to Parliament. And as I was mentioning to Tansri, the argument about Article 10, that Article 10 gives the right to freedom of association, that argument has never convinced me very much, because freedom of association is subject to morality. Morality is a large word. It can be interpreted to refer to ethics, political ethics. It can refer to the undertaking you take to the people, the representation that you make to the people, or was it a misrepresentation? So I would support an anti-hopping law, but not in such a way as to prevent the person from getting re-elected, not to disqualify him, but to ask him to go back to the people and say, last time I came to you with this ideology, this platform, now I've changed my mind. So that is hopping law. The other one, post-enactment. I'm sorry, I'm not so sure I got the full question, but my basic issue is this. All laws need change from time to time, because we have to accept one thing: life is always larger than the law. No law can anticipate the change of circumstances. A law passed 40, 50 years ago needs to be updated in view of the change of times. Now, we don't have a law reform commission, an independent law reform commission. I know in the Pejabat Peguam Negara there is a committee, but that's part of the executive. We need an independent law reform commission. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the process of Parliament consulting with committees and committees consulting with NGOs and affected groups, that tradition is not strong. So what I humbly suggest is this: almost every law that is enacted will require updating from time to time. Let there be in the law a clause asking the minister to appoint a committee of affected interests, people who are affected by that law. If it's a law about domestic violence, well, then there should be some men and some women, some lawyers, some people with religious background constituting a committee. The committee need not be permanent. It can be for 2 years, reporting to the minister. The minister then lays the report before Parliament. So that's my aim. In other words, what I'm suggesting is this, that citizens must get involved in proposals for law reform. But of course, to formalize it, the citizen must report to this committee. The committee will then report to the minister. Minister will then lay the report before the Dewan Rayat and Dewan Negara.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Emeritus, do you have other questions?
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Tan Sri. We have a question about the 10 special select committees established in Parliament, and how does Prof. Shad see the effectiveness of this special select committees in adding value to the current Parliament sitting? And the same person had added a second question here, asking about the Dewan Negara, which has been seen as a rubber stamp of bills. How do you think the role of the Dewan Negara can be enhanced and strengthened?
Thank you. These special committees are very much in the infancy. There are at the moment 5 committees that have always existed. The Public Accounts Committee, which actually is the most effective committee. Then there is a Rules Committee, there is a House Committee, there is a Privilege Committee, and I forget, there is a 5th one. So there are 5 standing committees that have always been there. What we wish to recommend is that there should be additional committees, for example, on human rights, on public grievances, on federal-state relations. These committees will definitely add value. But to assist the committees to perform their functions, we need support services. The committees have to be given some money to invite experts to advise them. The committee members must be given some allowances for the days they spend in their work. I've attended committee meetings in the Philippines, for example, Tan Sri. The committee will be meeting members of the public. I was a foreigner going there, sitting, listening. Coffee, tea, and sandwiches are served. And actually you can participate. So there'll be some financial implication. But it will take time. It will take time. But I feel that if Parliament is to become an effective institution, you can't really expect an impartial, neutral debate on the floor of the House. Because in our democratic parliamentary system, the House is too highly charged politically. If real work has to be done, it has to be done upstairs in the committee room, where sentiments will not be so political, where there'll be much more camaraderie between the ministers, between the MPs who may be from different sides. Also, because of the participation of NGOs, interested individuals, scholars, experts, the committees will be better informed. I have absolutely no doubt that this is where the remedy lies, to strengthen parliamentary committees. Whether 10 or 15, let's have a humble beginning. In the long range, as I said, every government department, every government ministry must have a counterpart parliamentary committee. Now, as to the Dewan Negara, yes, indeed, Dewan Negara has largely operated as a rubber stamp, so much so that at one time some MPs like the late Saudara Karpal Singh even once asked for Dewan Negara to be abolished. That's a matter of opinion. Actually, the Dewan Negara was meant to perform a number of functions. It was meant to be a revision chamber of bills passed by the Dewan Rayat. Dewan Rayat is more political. Dewan Negara represents the states. Each state has 2 senators, whether you are Perlis or you are Sarawak, 2 senators. And these senators were supposed to reflect the wishes of the states. Sadly, it hasn't operated that way. Then the Dewan Negara was supposed to have appointed senators to represent Orang Asli, to represent NGOs, to represent minorities, to represent groups that cannot possibly get representation under the democratic electoral process. Professionals may not want to give up their profession and join the hurly-burly game of politics. But Dewan Negara should have some professionals. So Dewan Negara was meant actually to represent the states, to represent professionals, to represent minorities, the disabled, the Orang Asli. It hasn't worked that way. Also, sadly, Dewan Negara meets 15, 20 days per year. Now that is rather embarrassing. Since it meets for 15, 20 days per year, only 25 days per year, the committee work also doesn't get done. So the Dewan Negara has largely operated as a rubber stamp. No bill has ever passed which was introduced by the Dewan Negara. Only one bill in 61 years passed by the Dewan Rayat was rejected by the Dewan Negara, and that is the Anti-Fake News Act. Its repeal was rejected, but Dewan Rayat bypassed the Dewan Negara under Article 68. So I'm totally in agreement with you that Dewan Negara has largely operated as a rubber stamp to the Dewan Rayat, but this need not be so. It can provide a second voice, a revision chamber. And by the way, if the Constitution's article is followed, that the state senators could be directly elected by the people, that would change the game. Then our Senate would be rather powerful because it will represent the Rakyat, just like the Senate in Australia or the Senate in the United States. Thank you.
It's an important point, Prof. And friends. And this question role of the Dewan Negara, I think, must be revisited, because I think much of the expectation was just related to federal-state relations, minorities, kind of thing you mentioned just now. But I think the economy has changed, society has changed, political situation has changed. Maybe you got to address certain issues, something like that. People, you talk about just now, say, representation of professionals. They can take up a lot of new suggestions to improve the economic governance of the country, for example, the core of accountants, the core of lawyers, and something like that. So things have changed. I think this is one area where we can do some reform. I agree with you. On the select committee, I think I, as an economist, see that I think the economic governance is very, very important because a lot of things have changed. For example, those days, what were given by the government, like basic need, things have changed now. What basic need then was different now. We're talking about privatization. We're talking corporatization. Utilities are now given by the society, no more public good. So this, I think, good to analyze the country. Yeah? And things have changed so the world over in terms of globalization. Yeah? So I think this one area, friends, and they're listening to us, which is we can improve the governance of the country by strengthening the Dewan Negara or the Senate. Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, Haris, any more other question?
Thank you, Tan Sri. There's a few questions that's been raised in the Q&A section about the many reforms that Prof suggested in the presentation earlier, and among these valuable proposals, and also considering the realities of slim majorities and also political fragmentation of our political landscape, which three reform measures do you think are most needed and viable to implement in the current circumstances? Yeah, so that touches more about the prioritization of the reforms that Prof mentioned earlier, and also the likelihood of them being adopted and also pushed through.
See, if I understand correctly, Tan Sri, the prioritization of the reform. Actually, even in my slides, the first important reform under the heading Other Reforms is committee system. So that's very important. Second one could be the number of days Parliament meets must be enhanced. Instead of 45 to 50 days or 60 days, I think they should meet more often. I know that Monday to Thursday, they take Friday off because they want to go back to the constituency. That's understandable. Constituency work is important. But long breaks, I don't understand why that should be so. The best example is now 6 months have passed actually, and in the last 6 months, Parliament has sat only for 1.5 to 2 hours. So I think besides the committee, we need more parliamentary sittings. A third possibility could be this, that you've got to improve support services for MPs. It's unfair for MPs to be able to decipher the budget. It's unfair to expect that an MP would be able to decipher the budget. The budget is a huge thing, both in terms of volume, in terms of complexity. You've got to have a budget office in Parliament that simplifies, summarizes, and says, if this is so, that's what is going to happen to the economy in the next 10 years. So I would put these three then: committees, a number of days, and support services for Parliament.
Let me add, Prof. Shad, especially on support services. I think I understand the members of the Congress in the US, they have congressional assistants who do a lot of researches for the Congress members of the Congress. So they speak based on real in-depth analysis of the issues at hand. You know? So they're very thorough, they're very comprehensive, but they are appraised of the real issues at hand. I think that's a good suggestion. We need good support services of the MPs. You can take some fresh graduates, for example, you know, train them as understand on the function of parliament. On that point, I'll call you later. Just on the question of suggestion Institute of Public Parliamentary Affairs, I thought was a good suggestion, where we can, you know, your suggestion Institute of Parliamentary Affairs is now. Yes. It's good because we can assist the parliament on their role, parliamentarians on their role, on the duties and the issues at hand, and so that they can, the parliament can partake in the discussion in a very, very analytical and professional way. I like that the suggestion. Just like you say, you have Intan for civil servant, but parliamentarians, they are our wakil rakyat. You know, they speak on our behalf. Some of us may not know what we need, but they are supposed to know what. That runs against. I want to take up with you on this matter, Prof. Shad, culture or political culture. You know what happens is that many wakil rakyat here, they are not legislators. They tend to be wakil rakyat taking the personal and social matter of the people at kampung and the area. My children don't have scholarship. My drains near the village not there, so they become like civil servant. You know, or my members in my kampung are jobless. Yeah. Can you help? So they got bogged down into doing civil servants' work. You know. Whereas in fact, there should be legislators taking up issue on policy, on budgetary allocation, you know, on proper laws and sort of thing. I think something wrong with our political culture. Do you want to comment on that? I'm using my facility as a chairman now.
Thank you so much, Tan Sri. I fully agree with that, that most MPs have been reduced to a role of attending kanduris, writing letters of recommendation for entry into university or license or permit. They don't really either have the training or the experience for attending to legislative work, financial work, environmental issues, human rights issues. Sadly, they know nothing about the Malaysian constitution, or very little. I'm just going to suggest something, Tan Sri, since Tan Sri is a board member of ISIS. ISIS could play a role perhaps in running short courses for MPs on the legal side, on the financial side, on the environmental side. I think ISIS could play a very constructive role here.
Yes, sorry. Any other questions?
Thank you, Tan Sri. Nur Izzah had mentioned in the questions, picking up the point you made about subsidiary regulations having to go through Parliament, as you suggested. Will it cause unnecessary delay to the execution of the law, since subsidiary laws mostly involve the administration or operational part of the Act? And we have another question here from Ryan about should the government consider the revival of the Parliamentary Services Act that was repealed in 1992? And would this revival be sufficient? He also adds that there were suggestions previously made by the Pakatan Harapan government to revive it by this year, although this has not happened. So appreciate your thoughts on that matter, Prof.
Thank you. I think I may have misspoken on subsidiary legislation. Subsidiary legislation does not go through Parliament. That's why it's called subsidiary. Subsidiary means that there is an act of Parliament which delegates power to a delegate. The delegate now, in the privacy of his office, frames the rules, sends them to the AG's office. They are gazetted in the Warta Kerajaan, and they are in operation. I won't go into the details of the laying procedures or scrutiny committees of Parliament in some countries. But subsidiary legislation, by its very nature, is not legislation by Parliament. It is legislation on the authority of Parliament by people outside. Who are these outsiders? They can be anyone. They can be actually a minister, they can be the IGP, they can be the governing council of a university, anyone. So subsidiary legislation does not go through Parliament. So that point about delay it's not relevant at all. There is no delay because I can draft it. If I'm the delegate, I can draft it tonight and have it gazetted by midnight tonight. Now, the second point was that subsidiary mostly involves operational matters. I have to beg to disagree with you on that. Sometimes subsidiary legislation affects our fundamental rights. If you look at subsidiary legislation, actually, it can affect tax measures. It can affect penalties. Subsidiary legislation can even be backdated under the Interpretation Act, Delegation of Powers Act. Subsidiary legislation can be backdated. Subsidiary legislation is allowed to stay within the four corners of the enabling law. It cannot go beyond. In addition, all laws in this country cannot violate the Perlembagaan, the Constitution. So subsidiary legislation is not only about procedure or about operational matters. Sometimes actually it affects basic issues and fundamental rights.
I would suggest, Prof, that when they were drafting the enactment, I think the subsidiary legislation must also be provided together so that it can be discussed together and be approved by the Parliament in one sitting. I know we used to call it a regulation.
Yes.
So you have the law, and then the minister may give some detailed regulations, and that is not discussed at the Parliament. No? And it can be unfair. Some can be unfair here. So I think I suggest that next time when they draft the law, the regulation or subsidiary legislation must be provided together with them, so that it can be debated and approved by the Parliament.
Yes.
Thank you. Any other?
I just want to add to that, Tansri, that in the UK, subsidiary legislation is laid before a special scrutiny committee, which then has the discretion to examine whatever they want. There's such a bulk of it, most of it they don't examine, but they will. They will look for some things. Was the subsidiary law, the regulation, whatever name called, regulation, rule, order, bylaw, was it backdated? Does it impose a tax? Does it provide for some fine? If it is so, they will look at it. Then they will report to Parliament. Thank you. But I agree with you that whenever the Parent Act goes to Parliament for amendment, the subsidiary must be provided.
Thanks, Prof. Harris, you have a set of questions?
Oh yeah, Parliamentary Services Act. There was one more question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Parliamentary Services Act. The Parliamentary Services Act, in my view, is necessary because Parliament should be independent of JPA regulations, parliamentary officers. At the moment, they are actually basically civil servants. Parliament should be independent. But I have to mention this. At one time, there was a separate parliamentary service. And then during the time of Tun Zahir, our speaker, that law was repealed and parliamentary services came under general public service. Now, I know that Pakistan promised to change this. I think the reason the thing fell through was because some of the issues will require a constitutional amendment. I did touch on this very briefly. When it comes to the secretary of the Dewan Rayat and Dewan Negara, they are part of the general public service. And they can be transferred to another public service. So that will require a constitutional amendment. And as you are aware, the government did not have 2/3. The last government did not have 2/3 in the Dewan Rayat and did not even have a simple majority in the Dewan Negara.
You have another set of questions?
Yep, but I think looking at the time, this would probably be the last set of questions. It's 15 minutes to 4, right? So let's begin this final set with a question on success. The claim, there's a attendee who claims that the key to successful reform is citizen participation. And whether Prof. Shad has any suggestions to achieve effective participation from the people. And also, I think that she highlights a risk of increased participation, where in the United States, private member bills have been largely influenced by lobbying groups like Big Pharma, etc. And a related question would be whether there will be a role for civil society and how can they play this role in affecting citizen participation in the country. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, when I was talking of citizen participation, I basically meant civil society. By citizen participation, I was not really thinking of people at the Pasar Malam, because while I have no disrespect for them, they are good people. Nevertheless, legislation, financial policy, environmental policy, educational policies, they require some detailed knowledge. They require a vision of the future and an understanding of the past. So I think civil society participation is the key to having laws that people will respect, and laws that will show tenderness for widest possible concerns. That can be achieved if bills are committed, habitually they are committed to committees, and the committees habitually invite citizens groups, NGOs or individuals who care to take the trouble to come to Parliament and give their evidence. So I think citizens' participation is very, very necessary, and that's what true democracy is. Democracy is not simply election every 5 years. Discussion before decision is the sine qua non of a democratic polity, and I think citizen participation is very necessary. But I have to alert you about one thing, because you gave the example of the USA. Let me also mention to you, sometimes civil society groups are actually destructive organizations. Take, for example, the gun lobby in the USA. Everybody knows you need laws to regulate the to have gun control. But the gun lobby is so powerful. The Jewish lobby, the gun lobby, the farmers lobby, and sometimes they actually have the interest of a small elite group in mind, but because they have the money and they have the power and they have sponsored MPs elections by giving donations, they're able to have their say. But this is not to imply that we should not go down this path, but it's just that we have to keep our eyes open, that civil society participation will not necessarily mean that the laws that will come out will necessarily be democratic, will be good for the economy, good for the environment, good for human rights. It need not mean, but nevertheless we have no choice. We have to listen to all sides and then make decisions. And finally, I'll just say this. Everyone who has been involved in lawmaking, and Tan Sri will, I'm sure, have his perspective on this. Everyone who's involved in lawmaking will acknowledge that laws are a delicate compromise between conflicting interests. There are no perfect laws, no ideal laws, and that's the way democratic society has to operate. Listen to all sides and then ultimately try to walk the middle path. But I think that will be achieved if there is more civil society participation in the legislative process, in the drafting of economic policy. Thank you very much.
Haris, you don't have any more questions, I presume?
We still have quite a lot, but I think time is running out. Given the
time.
queue. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I think, I'm sorry. Let me just say that, it was very interesting deliberation by Professor Shad. He's covered a lot of topics. topic, for example, need for law reform, and then establishment of select committee, and then how to improve the services to our parliamentarians and something. Certainly, I hope this discussion is not over today. Maybe we can follow up with further discussion, inshallah. But let me say there was a very good exposition by you on various topics of potential areas improvement of our parliament. I hope the power that be will pick up some of the suggestions and study detail. Certainly, like law reform, some of the laws are outdated.
Yes.
They're drafted by the British. I know certain technical standards not meant for road anymore, for example. And certainly, many of the laws are just talking about, the economic standards are even there.
Yes.
Things have changed a lot now in the economy. Market, that's something. That's something is not considered in many of our laws. Anyway, so again, I thank you very much, Prof, for making the time, and thank you everybody, our friends that are out there and who have been with us the whole afternoon. And inshallah, we will have some other occasion like this, and maybe also Prof Shad may want to talk another topic related to his assignment. Thank you again. Thank you, listener. Thank you again. Thank you, Datuk. No, thank you, Prof.
That's right. I just wanted to add, if any of our learned participants wish to have a copy of the paper,
Yes.
I'll be very happy to request ISIS to supply it.
Yeah, exactly. They can download.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.